No one expected the flashing lights to stop in front of that quiet house. It sat on a calm street where children rode bicycles and neighbors trusted each other without question. On a cold morning in 2023, police vehicles rolled up like a warning to the entire community, breaking the peace everyone thought they understood. When the door opened, a thin, silver-haired man stepped out, his frail frame wrapped in a sweater that seemed older than him. Wrinkles softened his expressions, and timid eyes hid behind thick lenses. To anyone watching, he looked more like someone needing help than someone being arrested. But the cuffs didn't loosen just because he looked weak. Officers held him firmly, treating him not like someone helpless but like someone who had hidden too long. A quiet anger surrounded them, a disgust that wasn't shouted, but clear in the way they refused to look at him with pity. Their silence spoke louder than outrage. This wasn't an arrest of a confused old neighbor. This was the capture of a man who had stolen more than time. Across the street, people gathered in disbelief. Mothers who once waved politely at him pulled their kids closer. A man who had helped him trim his trees now stared in confusion, trying to understand how decades of friendliness could mean nothing. The truth came out of that house in handcuffs, wrapped in the shaking hands of a man who had avoided justice for over 60 years. Crimes like this often pretend to age into innocence. But the truth doesn't forget. It waits. Before we explore this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. To his neighbors, Franklin Pierce was harmless. The kind of aging man who waved from his porch, moved slowly, and apologized for walking too slowly at the store. He baked cookies for children during holidays. He helped shovel driveways in winter, even when his back could barely bend. Parents trusted him. Teenagers mocked his shaky hands. No one imagined those hands had once been covered in the filth of violence, that they had destroyed a life, and then dared to grow old peacefully. The most painful part wasn't just that he committed a crime, it was how long he allowed people to believe he was safe. Everyone now stared at the same man they had trusted with their greetings, their kindness, and even their children, wondering how someone like that could walk around with such calmness. How could a man accused of crushing a family decades ago spend years giving gifts to children who had no idea what he had done? Detectives watched neighbors search for an explanation, asking questions that never brought comfort. Some defended him through trembling voices, desperate to protect their own sense of judgment. Others backed away, realizing that trust doesn't age into truth. One woman cried into her scarf, whispering, "I let my son mow his lawn for 5 years," as if each year had unknowingly tied her family to something rotten. The fragile body, the soft smile, the shaky voice, none of it erased the fact that someone's child vanished in 1960. And while everyone saw an old man losing strength, the truth revealed someone who had lived long enough to watch whole generations grow up without the person he took. Kind eyes can lie, soft voices can deceive, and a predator can live long enough to look like a harmless grandfather. Detective Kincaid had waited years for this moment. His team wasn't just making an arrest, they were finishing a war that began long before many of them were even born. As Pierce was guided toward the patrol car, Kincaid stepped closer, not to intimidate him, but to look him directly in the eyes. There was no sympathy in his expression, only a firm promise to the victim's family, delivered without a single word. Pierce's voice shook as he asked, "Is all this necessary?" Kincaid didn't raise his tone, yet his answer cut through the morning air like a blade. A murderer doesn't always age like a villain. No one expected that line to come from a detective who usually avoided dramatic statements. But nothing about this arrest was ordinary. 63 years of stolen peace deserved blunt truth. Franklin Pierce had lived through generations watching those who cared about his victim grow older, become parents, bury relatives, and fade into memories. He had survived long enough to pretend he belonged among them. That line echoed through the crowd because it wasn't just about Pierce. It was a warning: evil doesn't always keep the face it had when it struck. Sometimes it grows old, buys groceries, waters plants, laughs quietly at community events, and blends into routines. People think danger looks aggressive, loud, or unhinged. No one ever imagines it might walk with a cane, apologize for being slow, and sit alone at church, as if worn-out years could erase cold actions. Detective Kincaid didn't celebrate the arrest. There was nothing to celebrate when justice arrives so late that a killer's body is already fading. Pierce didn't fear prison. He feared finally being seen for what he truly was. Some crimes don't age. They wait for the moment someone refuses to let them stay hidden. As the patrol car pulled away, the entire neighborhood stood frozen. It wasn't a dramatic scene, no shouting, no desperate chase, just a quiet destruction of trust. People who once waved good morning now stared into empty space, trying to make sense of how they had been living so close to a secret that belonged in nightmares. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like everyone had suddenly inherited the weight of a truth they never asked to carry. Parents clutched their children not because danger remained, but because it had been present for decades without warning them. One teenager whispered to a friend, "He fixed my bike last summer." Another muttered, "He offered me cookies once." Their voices shook with something worse than fear, humiliation. They weren't scared of Franklin Pierce. They were scared of how easy it had been to trust him. Some neighbors stared at their homes as if checking whether evil might still be hidden somewhere nearby. Others walked back inside with a numbness that turned pity into disgust. The man they once saw as gentle had walked past them for years, carrying the memory of something that should have locked him away long ago. In that moment, the community learned a painful truth. Danger isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive wearing rage. Sometimes it smiles politely, ages quietly, and stays long enough to be mistaken for a familiar face. The arrest didn't just close a case. It opened a wound that had been ignored for 63 years. The year was 1961, and Royal Oak carried a glow that felt unstoppable. The streets were alive with music leaking from car windows, teenagers chasing their futures with carefree laughter, and store owners proud of every dollar earned. People still trusted their neighbors. Kids played outside until the street lamps flickered on, and families slept with their doors unlocked, convinced safety was a birthright. Factories ran loud, workers punched out with hope in their pockets, and Friday nights belonged to the youth. It wasn't a perfect city, but people believed it was good enough to build a life in. Royal Oak wasn't known for trouble. It was known for dances, football games, long drives, jukebox songs, and dreams so bright they felt invincible. Among those dreams were the teenagers who filled the community center every weekend. Their smiles were loud, their worries small, their futures unwritten. That night in October would be no different, or so everyone thought. Young boys fixed slick combs through their hair. Girls compared lip gloss shades, and every heartbeat seemed to echo with excitement. Parents waved goodbye from porches, reminding their kids to be home before midnight. Couples flirted in the crisp air outside the hall, passing around mints, nervous about their first slow dance. The world felt safe, too safe. Something rare happens when a city doesn't expect pain. People forget how fragile life is. They forget that danger loves comfort zones. They forget that innocence never promises protection. And on this particular night, Royal Oak stood proud, dressed in confidence, unaware that someone was about to destroy that illusion with a single choice. Before we follow the girl whose name would haunt this community, take a moment to ask yourself, what would a place like this protect you from? And what if it couldn't? Before her name became a wound in Royal Oak's history, Karen Stone was simply someone who made life feel lighter. She was 23, full of energy, and carried the kind of confidence that didn't intimidate. It invited people in. She didn't walk into a room, she brightened it. Not because she tried to be the center of attention, but because she paid attention to others. Karen worked as an elementary school librarian. She loved helping kids who struggled to read, staying late to label books by hand, and saving small drawings from her students in a folder she kept hidden in her desk. Some people collect trophies. She collected moments of kindness. On that February evening, her sapphire dress shimmered like she had borrowed the sky. It wasn't expensive, but it fit her personality, bold without trying, elegant without effort. The moment she stepped into the hall, heads didn't turn because she looked like a movie star. Heads turned because she looked genuinely happy to be there. She laughed easily. Not the kind of laugh that seeks attention, but the kind that makes others want to laugh too. Her friend Bev Sterling adored that laugh. Bev wasn't as outgoing, and she leaned on Karen's brightness like someone standing near a warm lamp on a cold day. And then there was Howard Jensen. Polite, quiet, always keeping a respectful distance, hoping one day she might choose him. But Karen wasn't cruel. She treated him with care, the same way she treated everyone who ever felt overlooked. Nothing about that night hinted at danger. Karen's life wasn't full of complicated conflicts or secret enemies. She was just young, thoughtful, and ready to go to work Monday with new library books to shelve. She had plans. She had promise. She was supposed to have time. The Woodward Avenue Community Hall pulsed with life that night. A blues band played, their notes stretching across the polished wooden floor, and the smell of popcorn and polished shoes hung in the air. The overhead lights reflected in sparkling eyes as couples twirled, friends clapped along, and the world outside seemed a distant thought. It was the kind of night people remembered for laughter and the easy comfort of being together. Karen moved through the crowd with a natural grace, her sapphire dress catching the light just enough to turn heads, not demand them. She laughed at small jokes, encouraged shy dancers, and even helped a clumsy boy regain his balance after a misstep. Every gesture was effortless warmth, the kind that stays with people long after the music stops. Beverly Sterling stayed close, enjoying the security of Karen's energy. Howard Jensen lingered in the background, his gaze hesitant, careful not to intrude, yet visible in the quiet way only those who care deeply can be. Karen noticed him, smiled, but left nothing unsaid. Her kindness never wavered, her boundaries never blurred. That moment, so ordinary, would echo for decades in memories that could not be forgotten. Outside, the snow had begun to settle in thin layers, crunching softly under occasional footsteps. Inside, the night continued with soft chatter, the scrape of chairs, and the fading notes of the band's final songs. No one thought about what would happen after the lights dimmed. They didn't know that happiness, in its purest form, sometimes attracts attention that isn't meant to be noticed. The energy in the hall was a reminder of what life could be. Warm, shared, and full of unassuming joy. That joy was Karen's, a beacon in a quiet city, a light that would not fade from memory, even when everything else did. Karen Stone's laughter wasn't just noise, it was the kind of sound that lingered in the corners of a room, leaving warmth behind. She moved through life noticing small details, the unspoken troubles of friends, the quiet victories no one else celebrated. People remembered her for how she made them feel, lighter, seen, safe, and included. That night, at the community hall, she radiated everything good and unassuming about youth, hope, kindness, and energy that demanded no attention, yet captured it anyway. It's the kind of light that makes you pause and think, who in your life shines like this? Who carries warmth without asking for it? Whose presence makes ordinary moments unforgettable? Karen's friends felt it, her family felt it, and anyone who had ever encountered her remembered it decades later. Even when the world had turned cold around them, she was a young woman with plans, a steady heart, and the kind of spirit that seemed eternal. Her path on that night was ordinary, full of simple joys, a dance with friends, a laugh shared, a hug exchanged, and a goodbye said without knowing it would be the last time. In the innocence of her steps, the sparkle of her dress, the tilt of her smile, she became more than a person, she became memory itself. And yet, life has a cruel way of taking light when it shines brightest. Karen's story is a reminder that even in the safest of places, tragedy can strike without warning. That's why this story matters not only as a mystery to be solved, but as a reflection of what we hold dear and how easily it can be lost. Karen Stone stepped out into the February night, the cold air biting at her cheeks, her breath forming small clouds that disappeared almost instantly. The dance hall behind her hummed with the fading music of a blues number, and the chatter of friends was warm in contrast to the winter darkness. She wore her modest tweed coat over the sapphire-blue dress, the fabric brushing lightly against her knees as she moved with an easy confidence that had always drawn people toward her. Beverly Sterling waved, her voice calling, "See you Monday, darling. Don't let Howard drink all the ginger ale." Karen's laugh floated back, bright and unconcerned. "I'll see you Monday, Bev. Take care." Those words, so ordinary in the moment, would later be dissected, replayed, and mourned. No one in Royal Oak could have imagined that a goodbye so casual could mark the last normal interaction Karen would ever have. She adjusted her coat, tucked her scarf neatly, and stepped onto the quiet, lamp-lit sidewalk. Each step was confident, unhurried, the rhythm of heels on frozen pavement, a small percussion accompanying her hum. The night was clear, stars blinking through the thin veil of clouds, snow crunching underfoot, as if the world itself were unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. The familiar streets stretched before her, safe and unremarkable. Nothing about that night suggested danger, and yet it was precisely in that comfort that shadows waited. Karen, alive with plans, laughter, and hope, walked toward what no one could have anticipated. The ordinary, gentle details of her evening, the warmth of friendship, the sound of her own voice, the tapping of her shoes would become permanent markers of a life interrupted. Victor Lowell, the janitor of the Woodward Avenue Community Hall, leaned on his broom for a moment, finishing the final sweep of the dance floor. His eyes drifted toward the doorway just as Karen Stone stepped outside. She hummed a gentle tune, soft and melodic, that floated through the frosty air. Victor couldn't have known he was witnessing a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but the memory of that night stayed, sharp and unshakable. He noticed the precise rhythm of her steps, the heels clicking on the frozen pavement, each tap echoing in the quiet street. The sound was simple, ordinary, yet it became etched in his mind, a heartbeat marking the last moments of safety before the unknown waited. Victor remembered the tilt of her head as she glanced at the darkened street, the scarf tucked perfectly around her neck, the laughter she carried from the hall fading into the cold night. Everything about her movement was alive, confident, unbothered by the dark street she crossed. Even her independence, the way she waved off Beverly's offer to walk her, spoke to her character. She had always been careful, aware, a woman who respected her surroundings, and yet, that care would not have been enough to shield her from what was approaching. Victor's gaze followed her as she turned the corner, disappearing behind the dim glow of a lamppost. The hum of her tune lingered in the air, the heel's sharp percussion fading, leaving a silence heavier than before. He did not see the vehicle creeping along the side street, its presence almost imperceptible, but it was there, moving slowly, a shadow in a world that believed itself bright and safe. Those few minutes, observed in quiet attentiveness, would become the critical memories of the last normal night Karen Stone experienced. Every sound, every movement, every detail mattered, though no one knew it yet. The night air held a brittle stillness, broken only by the faint crunch of snow beneath Karen's heels. She walked briskly toward her car, humming lightly, her breath rising in small clouds. The streets were familiar, safe, yet a dark sedan slid silently along the side street, a presence unnoticed by anyone who should have seen it. Its tires whispered against the icy pavement, almost blending with the sounds of the neighborhood. No lights flashed in warning, no horn blared. It was a vehicle meant to vanish into the ordinary rhythm of the evening, to merge seamlessly with the quiet confidence of a city that believed it was untouched by threat. From inside, someone watched Karen with intent that would remain hidden for decades. A single life crossing the threshold of normalcy into danger. Her heels clicked, steady and bright against the frozen street. She adjusted her scarf, glancing at the parked fare lane, unaware of the eyes tracking her every move. The hum of her song was gentle, fleeting, a reminder of all that was ordinary and good in the world. Yet, to someone hidden in that dark car, it was a beacon, a target, a moment ripe for interference. This is the moment most victims never recognize the threat sliding alongside them while the world continues its casual beat. The ordinary, the familiar, the The predictable rhythm of life becomes the perfect cover for danger. The tragedy isn't sudden. It's silent, creeping in unnoticed, until it has already arrived. Most victims never see the threat coming. Don't be caught unaware. Subscribe. Karen's steps carried her closer to the parked car, each tap marking a heartbeat, a pulse that would soon be interrupted. The night had changed, though she could not know it. Darkness did not announce itself. Danger wore no mask. Karen reached the intersection where the streetlights cast pools of weak gold across the snow. The Fairlane stood waiting, just as she had left it. Unremarkable, familiar. A small anchor in the quiet night. She opened the door, the metal cold under her gloved hands, and slid inside, expecting nothing beyond the ordinary. The night had carried no warning, no sound to signal the presence of someone waiting, no premonition that would have allowed her to step back, to turn, to be anywhere else. The hum in her throat lingered for a moment longer, mixing with the faint sound of tires skimming the ice. Then, it was gone. The street, once alive with her confident steps and melody, fell into stillness again. In those final moments, Karen moved from the comfort of light into shadows no one had anticipated. The world she trusted, the street she walked nightly, the neighbors she waved to, the town she loved was about to betray her. That innocence, so pure, carried her forward, unaware of the presence that had matched her pace, traced her movements, and waited for the instant to strike. Each step, each tap of her shoes, had been a note in a song that would end too soon, and though she did not know it, the night had already changed course. The familiar became frightening, and a life full of laughter and promise was about to be stolen from its rhythm. The quiet of Royal Oak that night would never feel the same again, and in that sudden void, the people left behind would begin a search that would stretch for decades. Sunday morning arrived with the sharp clarity of winter light reflecting off freshly fallen snow. Eleanor Stone set the table for breakfast, expecting the familiar sound of footsteps and Karen's cheerful greeting. But the house remained unbroken by the usual warmth. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still there was no knock, no hum of a tune, no rustle of a newspaper. Eleanor's heart sank. This wasn't like her daughter. Karen had always been punctual, reliable, someone who left traces of care in every corner she touched. Arthur Stone noticed his wife's unease, trying to soothe it with practical suggestions. Perhaps she slept in, maybe the meeting was postponed. But deep down, he felt the same gnawing unease, a shadow that whispered the ordinary could not explain the absence of someone so deliberate with her life. By noon, worry turned into alarm. They called friends, retraced her evening steps in their minds, and tried to convince themselves it was a misunderstanding. But the intuition of a parent, honed by love and shared years, refused comfort. Karen's Fairlane, parked where she had left it the night before, gleamed frost covered in the weak winter sun. The sight was a cruel confirmation. Their daughter had not simply wandered away, she was gone. Each second stretched, pulling their world into a quiet, pressing void. The morning's ordinary rhythm, so predictable, had collapsed. Every familiar sound, the clock ticking, the kettle whistling, the wind against the window felt too loud, too accusatory. The absence of Karen transformed the house into a place of tension, anger, and desperate hope. Eleanor and Arthur realized this was no simple disappearance. This was an interruption of life itself, an unjust silence that demanded answers. When the Stones called the Royal Oak police, they were met with a shrug of disbelief. Karen was young, vibrant, and a woman alone. The prevailing assumption of 1961 was cruelly simple. She had run off with a beau, indulged a whim, or perhaps skipped town without telling anyone. There was no urgency in the officers' voices, no acknowledgement of fear, just a casual dismissal that felt like salt on a wound already raw with anxiety. Eleanor pressed harder, recounting every detail. Karen's coat, her shoes, the sapphire-blue dress she had worn. She spoke of Karen's careful nature, her love for her job, her plans for Monday morning. But the police notes were thin, almost perfunctory. Arthur Stone felt frustration claw at his chest. How could anyone so intimately familiar with their daughter's habits ignore what they knew to be impossible? The era's sexism wasn't subtle. The idea that a young woman might vanish without warning was often interpreted as a moral choice, a teenage rebellion, or a flirtation gone awry. The Stones were treated not as witnesses to a potential crime, but as complainers irritated by their own family dynamics. Each conversation, each dismissal, deepened the sense of isolation and helplessness. Anger and disbelief took hold. How could those tasked with protection disregard obvious warning signs? Each officer's casual words piled into a mountain of injustice, a barrier that the Stones would face long before any real investigation began. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, compounded by the certainty that time, unclaimed and unaccounted for, was slipping irretrievably away. If you're still watching at this point, you might as well subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This dismissal wasn't merely a bureaucratic error. It was a statement of societal indifference, a refusal to recognize the urgency of a life interrupted. For Eleanor and Arthur, it became clear. If justice was to be served, they might need to fight it themselves. With the police offering little more than skepticism, Eleanor and Arthur Stone took matters into their own hands. Posters went up on lampposts and store windows, each one bearing Karen's smiling face in the sapphire-blue dress she had worn the night before. The letters to friends and nearby communities multiplied, each message a plea for information, a desperate hope that someone, anyone, had seen her. Day after day, the search stretched onward. Neighbors and friends combed through streets, parks, and alleys. Even local children were enlisted to keep an eye out, clutching hand-drawn flyers as though they could carry the missing girl home with them. The effort was exhausting, yet necessary. Every refusal to cooperate, every dead-end lead, only fueled the Stones' resolve. Emotionally, the couple teetered between hope and despair. Each small possibility, each fragment of rumor, was a lifeline snatched away by the relentless reality of silence. Karen's absence transformed every familiar street corner into a question. Where had she gone? Why had she vanished? The ordinary rhythm of life was gone, replaced by constant vigilance, whispered anxieties, and nights spent imagining scenarios no parent should ever contemplate. The anger was almost physical. How could a child so loved, so known, disappear and be dismissed? Every unhelpful police conversation, every apathetic comment, became a sharp reminder that their fight for answers was theirs alone. Every time someone shook their head, suggesting she had simply left voluntarily, it cut deeper, a fresh wound layered atop the growing grief. Yet through it all, Eleanor and Arthur pushed forward. Their commitment was absolute. Karen's life could not be reduced to a shrug or a presumption. The search became an act of love and defiance, a refusal to accept injustice simply because it was convenient. Their struggle illuminated a truth the town would soon feel. A missing person is never just missing, and the silence of authorities can be a cruelty all its own. Royal Oak, usually calm and confident in its small-town routine, began to feel the weight of unease. Whispers traveled down streets and through diners Karen Stone was missing. A sense of injustice rippled through the community as neighbors realized that the police were offering nothing beyond excuses and assumptions. Families who trusted authority now questioned it, wondering how easily concern could be dismissed. The Stones' desperate searches became public knowledge. Every conversation about the missing girl carried a bitter undertone, a warning about apathy, a reflection on what happens when those charged with protection refuse to act. The town had not yet seen the full horror, but the silence of those meant to safeguard it created fear that clung to every home. Anger and sorrow intertwined. Residents knew Karen personally, or knew someone who did, and each step of bureaucratic neglect felt like a betrayal. The authorities' casual dismissal wasn't just an oversight, it became a symbol of the failures that allowed tragedy to grow unnoticed. Citizens began asking themselves the questions no one had answers for. How could someone vanish and be treated as a choice rather than a crisis? What responsibility did those in power bear for ignoring early warnings? For Eleanor and Arthur, and for the town at large, The sense of void deepened. Their daughter's absence was not merely physical. It was a rupture of trust, of expectation, and of justice. Every street and storefront reminded them of the questions left unanswered, the failure of those sworn to protect, and the fragile nature of safety when authority looks the other way. Should police be held responsible when ignoring early warnings? Tell us. It was February 21st, 1961. A Tuesday that began like any other in Royal Oak, except for the group of teenagers cutting through the overgrown lot near Catalpa Drive and Main Street. They had no reason to linger, just a shortcut between homes and bus stops, the kind of path that held little intrigue beyond the occasional rustling of wind through scrub oak. One of them tripped over something bulky, and when they looked closer, a canvas tarp lay half hidden in the winter bare underbrush. Curious, they nudged it with hesitant fingers, the material cold and stiff. The sight beneath it froze them more effectively than the February chill. A body, wrapped crudely, discarded without concern, lay still among the brush. The teenagers screamed, their voices piercing the quiet streets beyond the trees. Panic and disbelief mingled with the shock of knowing immediately that this was no ordinary accident, no stray animal, no prank. They had stumbled upon a nightmare that had been silently waiting, months untouched, frozen in time until this unremarkable lot exposed it. By the time the adults arrived, the scene was both horrifying and surreal. The canvas, once an attempt at concealment, now marked the beginning of a truth the town could no longer ignore. Each footstep, each careful glance around the lot, only deepened the understanding that a young life, vibrant and full, had been stolen. This discovery shattered the fragile sense of security that Royal Oak had clung to since Karen's disappearance. A quiet town, confident in its safety, was suddenly forced to confront the reality of violence intruding into the ordinary. The teenagers, once carefree, now carried a secret burden, the memory of what they uncovered destined to follow them for decades. By the time the Royal Oak police arrived, the lot had already been disturbed. Curious onlookers, neighbors drawn by the teenagers' screams, and even a few local reporters had trampled over the snow-covered earth. Each step compressed the fragile evidence that might have told the story of what happened to Karen. Officers moved quickly, taking a few photographs, but there was no proper cordon. The tarp was lifted, examined, and removed. Yet the details of its placement, the surrounding footprints, and the subtle traces that might have revealed the perpetrator's movements were forever altered by the chaos. The tools of modern investigation, DNA, touch analysis, fiber collection, were either non-existent or applied haphazardly. What remained was a scene marred by haste, mismanagement, and a public unprepared to grasp the fragility of truth. Even within the limited scope of 1,961 forensics, the opportunity to secure the area was squandered. Fibers, shoe prints, and other minute clues were disturbed or ignored. The investigative team worked as best they could, but the absence of structure, combined with the pressing curiosity of a community now aware of a brutal reality, meant the case would start with a handicap. The failure to protect the scene weighed on the Stones' hearts as well. Eleanor and Arthur could sense, even then, that the authorities' oversight was robbing them of answers. Every step that mismanaged the evidence deepened their fear that the person responsible would remain untouchable, that their daughter's life might vanish again, this time in the hands of bureaucracy and error. The discovery had revealed the truth of her fate, yet the circumstances of her death remained a puzzle, obscured by human error. For a town already grieving, it was a bitter reminder that justice can be delayed, and sometimes the first steps toward it are already hindered by carelessness. Eleanor and Arthur Stone were summoned to the hospital, their hearts pounding with a mixture of dread and hope that waged war within them. The drive through the quiet streets of Royal Oak felt surreal, each passing house a reminder of normalcy now shattered by the absence of their daughter. Words failed them. The silence in the car was heavier than any conversation could have been. When they arrived, a nurse guided them to a small, curtained room. There, the canvas tarp had been carefully removed to reveal Karen's body. The sight struck Eleanor with a force that nearly collapsed her knees. The sapphire-blue dress, once radiant under the dance hall lights, was now stained and wrinkled, a haunting echo of the night she disappeared. Arthur's hands trembled as he reached out, knowing it would not be enough to bring her back. The hospital room was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. Every detail, the stillness of her form, the faint traces of struggle, the pale impression of life now gone etched into the stone's memory. Eleanor's sobs filled the room, raw and unrestrained, while Arthur gripped her shoulder, both seeking strength and offering none. The grief was instantaneous, sharp, and permanent. A realization that the daughter they had been searching for was no longer among the living. The emotional weight of identification pressed on them like a physical force. Karen's absence had been ambiguous for weeks. Now, the brutal clarity of death replaced uncertainty with irrevocable loss. Their world had fractured completely, leaving only despair and the impossible task of reconciling the daughter they knew with the tragedy before them. And in that small hospital room, while the parents faced the full gravity of the situation, the investigators were already beginning to turn their attention to those who had been with Karen the night she vanished, planting the first seeds of suspicion that would haunt some names forever. Within hours of the discovery, the investigation shifted into high gear. The authorities, driven by urgency and the pressure of a grieving community, immediately focused on those who had been close to Karen in the days leading up to her disappearance. Among the first questioned was Howard Jensen, the quiet man who had attended the dance with Karen and Beverly Sterling. Howard, polite and composed, described his interactions with Karen in painstaking detail. He recounted leaving the hall directly after the dance, returning home to rest for an early shift. His mother, Esther Jensen, corroborated his story. Yet, despite the alibi, the spotlight remained on him. In 1961, suspicion often fell on those who knew the victim well, and Howard, quietly devoted to Karen, became an involuntary figure of interest. Meanwhile, investigators reviewed the last known sightings. The hall janitor's memory of Karen crossing the intersection, humming to herself, shoes clicking sharply on frozen pavement. The faint recollection of a dark, heavy-set sedan passing slowly as she approached her car became a fragment of hope, a potential lead that, frustratingly, yielded little in actionable detail. The tension in Royal Oak intensified. Neighbors whispered about familiar faces being scrutinized, and the stones, already shattered, were thrust into a spotlight of procedural questioning. The sudden focus on acquaintances compounded their grief with a confusing mix of fear and frustration. They knew the answer lay elsewhere, yet the machinery of investigation seemed fixated on convenient, familiar targets. Despite the emotional strain, the initial questioning planted the earliest seeds of direction for the investigation. Patterns, alibis, and subtle inconsistencies began to form the outlines of suspicion. The community held its breath, aware that the person responsible could be anyone, a friend, an acquaintance, or someone entirely unknown. As the sun set over Royal Oak that day, the shadow of the first suspect lingered in the air. The investigation had begun, but for the Stones and the town, it felt like a tentative, fragile step toward justice. And yet, an unsettling truth remained. The person who had taken Karen might still be watching, waiting, hidden in plain sight. Howard Jensen's life, once quiet and predictable, was suddenly thrown into turmoil. The night Karen's body was discovered, his name became an anchor for suspicion, and he felt the weight of every questioning glance, every whispered conversation in Royal Oak. He had been a polite, unassuming man, devoted to his routine, yet now he was thrust unwillingly into the harsh glare of accusation. Repeated visits to the police station became the norm. Each trip left him drained, replaying the events of that evening in his mind with obsessive scrutiny. Every question was a reminder that, despite his innocence, he was treated as a potential perpetrator. His calm explanations were met with skeptical eyes, each officer convinced that the truth must lie somewhere in the circle of familiarity. The psychological burden was immediate and suffocating. Howard's confidence, once steady, now wavered with every step, every hesitant answer. Simple routines became tests. Walking past neighbors' homes felt like navigating a gauntlet of judgment. Every knock at the door, Every phone call carried a threat of exposure, an insinuation that he could be guilty even if nothing supported it. Howard's inner turmoil contrasted sharply with the ordinary life he had once known. The man who had quietly admired Karen, who had attended the dance with nothing more than friendship in mind, now bore the weight of a town's suspicion. Even the smallest interactions, casual greetings, brief nods in the streets were reminders that perception had overtaken reality. For Howard, the world had shifted from certainty to chaos. What had been mundane now felt dangerous, and the spotlight of suspicion, once brief, stretched endlessly. The subtle judgment in every conversation and the pressure of constant questioning left him anxious, questioning not only how others saw him but whether the truth could ever be heard. The police questioning grew relentless. Howard Jensen was summoned again and again, the sessions stretching for hours, each one eroding the stability of his mind. Every inquiry probed the minutiae of his evening with Karen, dissecting gestures, words, and movements as if the smallest detail might betray a hidden truth. Howard repeated his alibi countless times. He described leaving the dance hall directly after the music ended, walking home through familiar streets, and settling in for the early shift the next morning. His mother, Esther, confirmed his timeline. Yet the detectives pressed on, their skepticism unyielding. Every explanation he offered seemed to create more suspicion. Every word twisted in the tense atmosphere of the station. The room, dimly lit and oppressively silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers, felt like a courtroom of shadows. Questions were sharp, pointed, carefully designed to elicit inconsistency. Howard felt the pressure of each glance, the unspoken expectation that guilt must exist somewhere. His calm demeanor was tested, nerves frayed as the interrogators leaned closer, probing the quiet spaces between his words. Emotionally, Howard was trapped. Fear, frustration, and exhaustion interwove, creating a suffocating haze. He was innocent, yet every moment reinforced the impression that innocence was secondary to suspicion. He left the station each time feeling heavier, as though the weight of doubt had physically pressed him downward. The relentless scrutiny extended beyond the police station. Every step he took in Royal Oak seemed observed, every interaction tinged with unspoken judgment. The tension was not only institutional but social, an invisible force shaping his every move. And in the midst of it all, Howard could not shake the knowledge that a crime had been committed, that a life was lost, and that the real culprit remained unseen. Outside the police station, the town of Royal Oak began to speak in hushed tones. Howard Jensen's name traveled quickly through neighborhoods, diners, and workplaces, carried on the wings of rumor and fear. Each whisper added weight to a reputation that had been quiet, ordinary, and unnoticed before tragedy struck. Neighbors who once greeted him with casual friendliness now watched him with suspicion. Colleagues at the automotive plant offered polite nods, but their eyes told a different story: judgment, doubt, and a subtle, unspoken accusation. Howard felt it everywhere. On the street, in the grocery store, even through closed doors. The world he had known, familiar and predictable, became a landscape of scrutiny. Social isolation followed. Invitations vanished. Casual conversations dwindled to polite but distant exchanges, and friends hesitated before speaking his name. Howard, once a quiet observer of life, now found himself the subject of conversations he could not influence or control. Each misstep, each glance, interpreted as nervousness, seemed to confirm what he had never done. The constant suspicion began to erode his confidence. Even minor daily tasks, like walking past the school where Karen had taught, or passing by the dance hall, carried a tension he could not escape. Royal Oak, a town that had once offered comfort, now felt like a cage. Every interaction reminded him that perception could outweigh truth, and while Howard bore this unfair burden, the real perpetrator remained untouched, hidden in plain sight. The community's whispers, while understandable in their grief and fear, amplified a narrative that had no basis in fact. Howard became a false villain, his life upended, his character questioned, and his innocence overshadowed by a collective need for answers. Despite the mounting suspicion and the suffocating pressure, Howard Jensen remained innocent. Each accusation, each questioning session, and each whisper in Royal Oak weighed heavily. Yet the truth of his role, or rather, his lack of one, was unwavering. Howard had been present at the dance, had admired Karen in friendship, and had left the night exactly as he claimed. Nothing connected him to the crime beyond proximity and circumstance. The police, focused on familiar faces and immediate convenience, had succumbed to tunnel vision. Howard, with no motive, no secret, and a clear alibi, had become a stand-in for the town's fear. His reputation, painstakingly built through years of quiet work and respectful interactions, was overshadowed by the false narrative of guilt. Each day of suspicion added layers of injustice, the pain of being misjudged, compounded by the knowledge that the real culprit remained free. For Howard, relief came only slowly, a subtle easing rather than a sudden release. The truth would eventually emerge, but in those early months, every encounter, every pointed look, reminded him that innocence offered no immediate protection from accusation. His story highlighted a harsh lesson. Sometimes, the shadow of crime falls on those who did nothing wrong, and society can be as cruel in judgment as any criminal in action. Controversy lingered in the air, and for viewers reflecting on the case, one question remained urgent. Was the police tunnel vision a mistake or necessary? Comment, yes or no. The answer was not simple, and the tension between justice and perception would echo through Howard's life, long before the real killer was ever identified. In the weeks following Karen Stone's murder, the initial energy of the investigation gradually fizzled. Royal Oak, once consumed by urgency, began to feel the oppressive weight of silence. Police efforts, once focused and unrelenting, slowed as leads failed to materialize. The excitement of potential clues gave way to frustration and fatigue. Witnesses' recollections blurred over time. The janitor's memory of a dark sedan passing slowly near Karen's car remained tantalizingly vague. Descriptions were inconsistent, license plates forgotten, faces obscured by nightfall. Each tip arrived with hope and left with disappointment. The once bustling investigation room became a quieter, stagnant space. Detective notes piled up, but actionable evidence was scarce. Community tension grew alongside the case's inertia. Conversations that had once been open and concerned became hushed, punctuated with fearful glances toward the streets and neighbors. The town felt like it had been suspended in a permanent winter, where every moment of normalcy was weighed against the lingering absence of answers. Parents whispered caution to their children, and every unfamiliar car passing through quiet avenues drew suspicion. Eleanor and Arthur Stone watched helplessly as the investigation stalled. Every day without news felt like another echo of emptiness. They understood the reality. Time was slipping away, and with each passing week, the probability of resolution seemed to diminish. Yet, their resolve did not waver. The case had become a consuming shadow over Royal Oak, and the failure of momentum only magnified the sense of injustice. The town, once confident in its safety, now lived under an unspoken tension. Streets that had seemed familiar now felt like corridors of uncertainty. The killer had vanished into ordinary life, leaving Royal Oak to suffocate under a cloud of unanswered questions, the unknown perpetrator still moving freely among them. As the investigation faltered, Arthur Stone faced a grim reality. The official channels had failed. The police had no new leads, and the weeks of dead ends only deepened the chasm of despair. For Arthur, inaction was unbearable. He needed to do something tangible, something that might push the search forward, no matter the personal cost. In a decision that would reshape the remainder of his life, Arthur sold his small accounting business. The modest sum provided the means to hire a private investigator and pursue avenues the police had abandoned. Each transaction, each paperwork signature, was a small surrender of a comfortable life in exchange for the slim hope of justice. Eleanor watched, her heart heavy, as her husband willingly gave up their financial stability, propelled by grief and a relentless desire to find the truth. People always forget to subscribe. So here's a quick reminder before we continue. Arthur's dedication was tireless. Days were spent coordinating searches, distributing flyers, and following up on every fragment of a potential lead. Evenings were consumed by research, combing through records, and reaching out to anyone who might recall a detail. The burden of responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. Sleep came in fragments, and meals were often forgotten. Grief intertwined with determination, creating an unyielding drive that refused to acknowledge limits. Through it all, Eleanor provided support, though her anxiety never abated. Together, they became the human engine of the investigation, moving forward when the official machinery had stalled. Their sacrifices were profound, marking a stark contrast to the quiet routine of the rest of Royal Oak, which had begun to adjust to the unresolved tragedy. Arthur's gamble reflected a deeper truth. In a world where justice seemed slow and indifferent, personal action often became the only recourse. The stone's devotion illuminated the stark reality that the path to answers could demand everything, and the emotional cost was both immediate and enduring. Among the few threads of hope, the janitor's account of a dark sedan passing near Karen's car seemed promising. Yet, as days turned into weeks, that lead slowly unraveled. Details became muddled in retellings, and each follow-up produced nothing concrete. The car's make and model, once a clue that might have revealed the perpetrator, became just another faded memory. Investigators chased shadows. Calls went unanswered, addresses led nowhere, and tipsters often misremembered critical moments. The frustration within the police force mirrored the anxiety gripping Royal Oak. Every time the dark sedan was mentioned, hope surged briefly, only to collapse under the weight of unverified information. Each failure chipped away at the community's confidence, leaving citizens in a state of quiet unease. For the Stone family, the lack of progress was devastating. Every dead end was a stark reminder that their daughter's life had been stolen, and no one would answer for it. Eleanor and Arthur, already exhausted from personal searches and private investigations, confronted the reality that the killer had moved freely among them, invisible in the streets, among neighbors, unnoticed and unchallenged. The town, meanwhile, began to suffocate under tension. Every unknown figure on the sidewalk, every unfamiliar car rolling through quiet avenues, reminded residents that danger lingered unseen. Ordinary daily activities, once taken for granted, now carried a shadow of caution and suspicion. Parents monitored their children more closely. Neighbors observed each other more keenly, and the collective anxiety of the community thickened like an unshakable fog. In this period of stagnation, Royal Oak learned a chilling truth. A crime unpunished does not disappear with time. It simmers silently, eroding trust, twisting perceptions, and leaving ordinary people under the quiet, unsettling impression that the perpetrator was still among them, moving in plain sight, free, and unaccountable. As the weeks stretched into months, the Stone family's despair deepened, and the town's unease solidified. The police had no new leads. The janitor's witness memory had grown cold, and every hopeful tip ended in frustration. Yet the most unsettling truth remained. The killer was still living among them. Royal Oak continued its routines, unaware of the invisible threat that walked the streets alongside them. Neighbors shopped side by side with the murderer. Children played near someone capable of unspeakable violence, and the town carried on in a fragile, tentative normalcy. There were no sirens to warn, no arrests to reassure, only the knowledge that justice had not yet arrived. For Eleanor and Arthur Stone, every passing day without answers was a painful reminder that the world outside their grief had moved on. Yet the killer existed in the same space as families, strangers, and friends, untouched and unchallenged. Each glance at the grocery line, each encounter on a snowy sidewalk, carried the subtle terror that the person responsible for their daughter's death had never been caught. This period of stagnation cemented a haunting reality for the community. Evil can reside unnoticed in ordinary life, and closure is not guaranteed by the passage of time. While Royal Oak carried on, the shadow of Karen Stone's death lingered silently in every corner, every interaction, every ordinary day. The final chilling thought remained inescapable. The killer was still buying groceries among them. And, by 1966, 5 years had passed since Karen Stone vanished from the streets of Royal Oak. The once vibrant energy of the town had dulled, replaced by a lingering heaviness that seemed to hang in every home, street, and workplace. People moved through their days with a subtle tension, never fully free from the reminder that a young woman had been taken, and the crime had gone unanswered. The police formally declared the case cold, a phrase that felt like a dagger to the hearts of anyone who still hoped for answers. Officially, investigation efforts had ceased. For the town, this declaration was more than a procedural note, it was a verdict of helplessness. Citizens whispered about the young librarian in hushed tones, unable to reconcile the unresolved tragedy with the otherwise quiet, ordinary world they inhabited. Community gatherings carried an undercurrent of unease. Neighbors exchanged cautious glances when speaking about the past, and parents instilled a quiet wariness in their children. The streets, once lively and familiar, seemed narrower and less forgiving. Each winter's snowfall became a reminder of Karen's last steps, each familiar landmark a marker of absence. Despite the slow pace of life, the memory of Karen Stone was vivid. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike remembered her smile, her voice, the enthusiasm she brought to every room. In a town once confident in its safety, fear and sorrow had taken root. Royal Oak had become a place where a missing life was never forgotten, and the gap left by Karen's absence shaped the rhythm of daily life. The declaration that the case was cold did not erase hope entirely, but it crystallized a collective grief, a persistent shadow that settled over Royal Oak, a quiet reminder that justice had failed, and the cost of that failure extended far beyond a single family. As the years passed, Karen Stone's presence lingered in Royal Oak like an unspoken truth. She became more than a name in police files. She became a quiet warning, a story told in whispers. Students and teachers spoke of her absence with a reverence and unease that left the memory alive yet painful. Parents reminded children to stay close, to be cautious, invoking Karen's story without naming her directly, her fate a lesson, a shadow threading through daily life. Her sapphire-blue dress, her bright laughter at the dance hall, the ease with which she moved through her world. These details became emblematic of a life stopped too soon. Karen was remembered as the girl who carried light into every room, a presence impossible to forget. Every street she had walked, every place she had visited, bore an echo of that lost vitality. In conversations, she became the standard against which community members measured their memories of innocence and safety, a silent mirror reflecting what had been stolen. Local legends and stories of the vanished librarian emerged as part cautionary tale, part tribute. Children grew up hearing fragments. Adults recounted the facts cautiously, and the collective imagination of the town filled in the spaces left by absence. Karen existed simultaneously in memory and myth, her life frozen in time, her absence a reminder that tragedy could strike in the midst of familiarity. Even the Royal Oak Police Department, long accustomed to cold files, could not escape the imprint of her story. Karen Stone was more than a case number. She was a ghost that reminded everyone that unanswered crimes leave scars far beyond the immediate victims. She haunted the town not as a figure of fear, but as a vivid reminder of life interrupted, potential erased, and the quiet endurance of grief in a community still seeking resolution. Eleanor and Arthur Stone aged carrying the weight of a grief that never lessened. Each passing year deepened the void left by their daughter's absence. Life milestones, once full of shared joy, passed quietly, shadowed by unanswered questions and the relentless ache of what had been stolen. Birthdays, holidays, even simple mornings at the breakfast table. Everything was tinged with the absence of Karen's voice, her laughter, her presence. Arthur, who had sacrificed his business and comfort in relentless pursuit of answers, felt the relentless passage of time acutely. Every effort that failed to bring resolution added a layer of exhaustion to his body and spirit. Eleanor, constantly vigilant and anxious, bore her own silent torment. Each day without progress carved deeper lines into her face. Each unanswered lead a fresh sting of despair. Their lives became defined by absence. Family outings were incomplete, holidays hollow, and moments that should have been joyous were always tempered by the memory of their lost daughter. Friends and neighbors tried to offer comfort, but words could not fill the emptiness that had settled permanently into their home. Their love for Karen endured as an unbroken thread, connecting them to a life forever beyond reach. Even as their health declined and time pressed forward, neither parent relinquished the hope of justice. The case's stagnation, however, made hope a fragile companion. Each day reminded them that the killer had remained free, and each passing year intensified the injustice of it all. The world moved on around them, yet their grief anchored them in a painful past, where the absence of answers was as acute as the absence of their daughter. The Stone family's story became a testament to the enduring toll of unresolved tragedy, a life stolen once by violence, and again by time without justice. Karen Stone's death was a devastating loss, but the years that followed inflicted a second, quieter theft. The theft of closure, of peace, of the possibility that justice might restore balance to a shattered life. While Eleanor and Arthur grew older, the case's stagnation continued to erode the very fabric of their daily existence, leaving grief unrelenting and raw. The community, too, endured the consequences of time without resolution. Royal Oak carried the weight of unanswered questions like a constant undertow. The memory of Karen, a reminder that even in ordinary towns, tragedy could strike without warning. Each street, each neighborhood, became a stage for subtle fear, a caution for what might remain hidden in the ordinary. Karen's life had been stolen once by the brutal act of a stranger, and yet, the inaction and delays of those meant to protect and pursue justice had taken from her family a second time. They were denied the simple relief of knowing, the quiet reassurance that someone had been held accountable. Her story, preserved in whispers and remembrances, became a living grief, replayed and relived every year, in every reflection of what might have been. The tragedy of a life stolen twice resonates beyond statistics or reports. It is the enduring absence, the impossible what if, the daily echo in homes and hearts of those left behind. Karen Stone's story reminds us that injustice can extend far beyond the moment of death, shaping the lives of everyone left to carry its weight, and that some losses cannot be measured solely in years, but in the emotional void that stretches across decades. Detective Alana Kincaid had built her career around one unwavering principle. No case, no matter how old, should be left unresolved. Her office walls were lined with folders of cold cases, each representing a life interrupted, a family still waiting, a truth yet unspoken. When Karen Stone's file landed on her desk in early 2023, it was heavy with decades of neglect, but it carried a spark she could not ignore. Kincaid understood the stakes instantly. Karen's disappearance had haunted Royal Oak for generations, the unresolved mystery, a constant whisper of injustice. Reading through the brittle, yellowed pages of interviews, witness statements, and fading photographs, Kincaid could almost hear the echo of Karen's laughter, the hum of that final night in February 1961. Every detail mattered. The small ones, the overlooked ones, the fragments that had been dismissed as irrelevant. Her eyes lingered on the handwritten notes from 1961, on the initial missteps of investigators who had underestimated the crime, on the cursory examination of the fair lane, and the rushed documentation of the wooded scene. There was anger here, yes, but also purpose. Kincaid knew that modern forensic science could give voice to what had been silent for over 60 years. She felt the weight of responsibility, not only to Karen, but to every family left dangling in the unresolved pain of a crime frozen in time. Decision made, Kincaid assembled her team. They would approach the case with fresh eyes, rigorous methodology, and the patience to respect both the past and the promise of modern investigation. The dusty files, long ignored, were about to be awakened. The detective's dedication transformed the cold, lifeless paperwork into a living path toward justice. and the first step was clear. Examine every piece of evidence with the precision and care that 1,961 had denied it. The evidence box sat in the corner of the Oakland County evidence vault, coated in decades of dust, its corners dented and edges worn. Labeled simply, Stone K. Homicide 1961. It had been moved from shelf to shelf over the years, forgotten by time yet preserved with an almost stubborn fidelity. Inside, the contents seemed unremarkable at first glance. A canvas tarp, a few fibers collected from the crime scene, and Karen's sapphire-blue dress, folded neatly in a sealed paper bag. But Detective Kincaid knew better. Every item held a story, every fiber a whisper of what had occurred. As she lifted the tarp from its box, Kincaid felt a chill. This was not merely evidence. It was a testament to years of silence. The canvas, once crudely discarded in the woods, had preserved microscopic secrets that 1,961 investigators could not have imagined. The dress, delicate and frayed with age, was more than clothing. It was a vessel of Karen's final moments, a link to the night that had shattered her family and unsettled a community. Every fiber, stain, and crease became a point of focus. Kincaid instructed her team to handle each piece with extreme care, mindful that these items carried the weight of a life lost and decades of unanswered questions. Photographs of the dress were taken, samples meticulously catalogued, and notes compared to the old case files. In this quiet, methodical handling, the past began to stir, and the long-frozen crime whispered of possibilities previously unreachable. The evidence box, once dormant, had become a gateway, a symbolic rebirth for a case that had been abandoned in despair. It contained the first tangible connection between the past and the future, the bridge over which justice might finally travel. The next step was delicate yet revolutionary, extracting what modern science calls touch DNA. The tiny traces of skin cells, invisible to the naked eye, had waited silently for decades on the canvas tarp, Karen's dress, and the fibers collected at the scene. In 1961, these details were dismissed as non-identifiable organic material, inconsequential remnants of a crime poorly investigated. In 2023, they were the keys to truth. Detective Kincaid oversaw the careful collection of the samples. Each swab, each microscopic particle was sent to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, where technicians worked with instruments that could detect, amplify, and analyze what had long been imperceptible. The process was painstaking, slow, and precise. A single mistake could compromise decades of waiting. Yet the tension was electric. For the first time, hope and possibility mingled with the weight of history. As the lab began its work, Kincaid reviewed the old case files again, cross-referencing witness statements, timelines, and the minimal forensic work conducted in 1961. The contrast was stark. Where once there had been frustration and missed opportunities, now there was science with a promise. The unknown assailant, who had eluded identification for 62 years, might finally leave an indelible mark, an invisible signature that modern technology could read and interpret. Every day brought anticipation, and every result, every preliminary readout, was a potential breakthrough. Kincaid understood the magnitude. These small, unseen traces could finally shatter decades of silence, vindicate a family long denied answers, and confront a community with the truth it had waited half a century to hear. The pieces were fragile, but they carried power. The power to awaken a past that refused to remain buried. With the DNA profile established, Detective Kincaid and her team turned to a method unheard of in 1961. Investigative genetic genealogy. The unknown male profile, unlinked to any criminal database, was uploaded to public genealogy platforms. The aim was not just to find a name, but to map a family tree, to trace connections that could lead to the perpetrator. Every match, no matter how distant, became a thread to follow, a clue in the intricate tapestry of hidden relationships. The process was painstaking and fraught with uncertainty. Every day brought a blend of hope and tension. as genealogists painstakingly traced distant relatives, mapping birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and social histories. The unknown killer's shadow stretched across decades, yet the team refused to yield. Each revelation in the genetic puzzle brought them closer, narrowing the field, teasing the identity of the man who had taken Karen Stone's life. For Kincaid, the emotional weight was immense. She imagined the Stone family, though long gone, watching silently, waiting for justice denied for 62 years. Every carefully confirmed connection, every verified match, became more than technical progress. It was a promise to the past that someone would finally be held accountable. The suspense built as distant relatives were identified, family trees cross-referenced, and the net slowly tightened around a single branch that had eluded suspicion for decades. The quiet hum of the lab and the meticulous work of genealogists felt electric, a bridge connecting two eras, the unresolved crime of 1961 and the precision of modern investigation. And now, as the first true leads emerged from the shadows of time, a critical realization dawned. Justice could finally catch up. If you want justice to catch up to the past, join us, subscribe. Detective Kincaid watched the genealogists at work, tracing lines of birth and marriage, death and relocation, across decades and continents. Each connection was a potential breakthrough, a link that might finally reveal the identity of the man who had haunted Royal Oak for 62 years. The unknown DNA profile was a silent witness, and the team treated it as such, following the faintest traces through historical records, public databases, and family documents. The task was painstaking, the stakes monumental. Every branch of the family tree brought them closer, or sometimes led to dead ends. Some distant relatives were uncooperative, others simply unreachable. Yet each revelation, each connection made, narrowed the field, creating an invisible net that would eventually ensnare the culprit. For Kincaid, the tension was personal. She felt the presence of the Stone family in every file, every historical photograph, every carefully cross-referenced name. They had waited decades for justice, and she would not allow another misstep to deny them answers. The painstaking search through a labyrinth of genealogical data became a race against time, not just against the unknown perpetrator, but against the quiet fading of memory itself. Every lead raised hope and uncertainty. Each verified connection was a tentative step forward, each discarded path a reminder of the magnitude of the challenge. Yet, with every day, every thread carefully followed, the net slowly tightened around the man who had remained hidden in plain sight. The silence of 62 years was about to be broken, and Kincaid and her team were the instruments of that revelation. After months of painstaking work, the genealogists finally traced a cluster of matches that pointed to a single branch of the family tree. Silas Decker. Born in 1937, he had lived quietly in Royal Oak during the early 1960s, blending seamlessly into the community. There was nothing in his life that would have drawn suspicion. He worked a simple job at a service station, interacted politely with neighbors, and left no obvious trace of the violence he had committed decades earlier. Kincaid felt a mixture of disbelief and urgency. The genealogical map narrowed to a man who had existed under the radar for over 60 years, whose life had been outwardly ordinary, yet whose past held unimaginable darkness. Every document, every census record, every family tree node reinforced the chilling possibility. They were closing in. The team reviewed old photographs and historical records of the area, piecing together a timeline that matched Silas Decker's known whereabouts with the night of Karen Stone's disappearance. There was no direct proof yet, only the growing tension of convergence. The stakes were higher than ever. If the match held, they would finally reveal the man who had evaded accountability for decades. Kincaid's pulse quickened with the weight of anticipation. Every conversation, every calculation, every careful verification brought the past and present into collision. The Silas Decker branch of the family tree was no longer a distant hypothesis. It was a concrete lead, a tangible point of focus, in a case that had been frozen in silence for more than half a century. The next step would demand precision, courage, and a careful confrontation with truth. With Silas Decker identified as the prime suspect, the next step was delicate. Obtaining a DNA sample that could confirm what genealogical evidence suggested. Detective Kincaid and her team conducted surveillance, observing him without drawing attention, aware that any misstep could compromise the investigation. Every movement, every routine action became crucial. This was the moment where decades of careful work would meet the present. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Decker, now living under the name Franklin Pierce, left a cup of coffee on a public bench near his home. Kincaid's team approached cautiously, collecting the item as evidence without alerting him. The tension was palpable. A single mishandling could ruin the fragile link to 62 years of unanswered questions. Back at the lab, technicians carefully extracted DNA from the abandoned cup. The process was painstaking and meticulous. They amplified trace skin cells, cross-checked sequences, and compared the profile against the genetic evidence recovered from Karen Stone's dress and the canvas tarp. Each step felt like walking a tightrope, balancing the enormity of potential discovery with the need for flawless execution. Kincaid watched the process unfold, her focus unwavering. She knew the implications. A match here would not just identify the perpetrator, it would rewrite the final chapter of a story that had haunted a community for generations. Every detail mattered, from the smallest swab to the precise sequencing of DNA markers. In that lab, in those quiet moments, justice was no longer theoretical. It was within reach. The pieces of the past and present were converging, and soon, the truth that had eluded Royal Oak for more than 6 decades would emerge in a form both shocking and undeniable. The lab results arrived, and the confirmation was almost impossible to believe. The DNA extracted from the abandoned cup matched the trace evidence on Karen Stone's dress and the canvas tarp with near-certain probability. 62 years of silence, decades of unanswered questions, had been shattered by a single invisible thread. Detective Kincaid felt a mixture of relief, disbelief, and the weight of decades-long grief, finally finding resolution. But the revelation did not end there. As the investigators prepared to make the arrest, they discovered that Silas Decker had legally changed his name decades ago. To neighbors, friends, and the unsuspecting community, he was Franklin Pierce, a frail, ordinary-seeming man who had lived an unremarkable life. The contrast between the man they would confront and the monster he had been in 1961 was staggering. A killer, hidden in plain sight, had moved through decades of life completely undetected. Kincaid reflected on the enormity of the situation. The arrest would not just solve a crime, it would force a community to confront the unsettling truth that a person capable of murder could appear ordinary, polite, even gentle. For 62 years, Franklin Pierce had walked freely among them, blending seamlessly into a world that assumed innocence. The discovery brought a strange mixture of emotions: vindication, horror, and a profound sense of justice finally catching up with time. The story of Karen Stone, a life stolen in youth, was approaching its long-awaited reckoning. As the team prepared to move forward, Kincaid knew the moment of confrontation would not just be about the arrest. It would be about the emotional closure, the accountability, and the final unveiling of a truth that had eluded generations. Justice can arrive decades later if you want to witness it. Subscribe now. In 1961, Franklin Pierce, then Silas Decker, was a quiet man whose presence rarely drew attention. He worked at the local service station, performed daily routines without incident, and existed in the background of Royal Oak life. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a dangerous fixation had taken root. Karen Stone, with her easy laughter and radiant spirit, had unknowingly captured his attention. Day after day, Pierce observed her comings and goings. He noted the patterns, the times she left work, the friends she spent time with, the modest car she drove. His infatuation was not acknowledged by anyone else. It hid in plain view, invisible to the casual observer. But within him, the fixation festered, growing into a quiet obsession. The danger of his mind was invisible to the world, He was neither violent in public nor outwardly alarming. To neighbors, he was polite, helpful, and unremarkable. Yet in the private corners of his mind, he rehearsed encounters, imagined scenarios, and convinced himself that Karen's attention or her refusal to give it was a personal affront. Detective Kincaid later reflected on the chilling reality. The most terrifying monsters are sometimes those who do not outwardly appear dangerous at all. The ordinary polite man walking a quiet street can hide a lifetime of intent, and in 1961, Royal Oak had such a man moving among them, unnoticed. The tension of this quiet obsession set the stage for a tragedy no one could have predicted. Every small observation, every seemingly trivial detail Pierce collected became part of a dangerous calculus that would culminate in a violent act. We protect each other here. Join our community. The night was bitterly cold. The streets of Royal Oak quiet, except for the faint crunch of snow under Karen's heels. She approached her car, humming softly, her sapphire-blue dress still catching the faint glow of the streetlights. Franklin Pierce, hidden in the shadows, watched. Every step she took, every movement, fed the obsessive calculations that had built in his mind over months. As she neared her car, Pierce stepped forward. His approach was silent but deliberate, an intrusion into a world where Karen had expected only safety and routine. She paused briefly, sensing an unfamiliar presence, yet her confidence remained unwavering. She had always navigated her life with a combination of awareness and independence, traits that had drawn others to her light. For Pierce, this encounter was the moment everything he had imagined collided with reality. Karen's presence, vibrant and untouchable, became the focus of his deluded mind. He confronted her, not as a known enemy but as a perceived obstacle to his desires. The tension between them was immediate and sharp, invisible to anyone but the two of them, yet deadly in its implications. Karen, perceptive and composed, responded with calm assertiveness. She refused his advances without hesitation. A simple act that would have been inconsequential in most circumstances, but not for a mind consumed by possession. Pierce's obsession had built to a point where rejection could no longer coexist with his desire. The encounter, brief and contained, would ignite the tragedy that had been decades in the making. Most victims never see the threat coming. Don't be caught unaware. Subscribe. Karen Stone's response to Franklin Pierce was immediate and unwavering. She met his gaze with a mixture of calm confidence and firm refusal, a quiet strength that had defined her entire life. To anyone observing, it was an ordinary interaction, a polite dismissal. To Pierce, however, it was a challenge he could not accept. Her defiance was not born of fear but of clarity. She understood her own autonomy and would not allow intimidation or pressure to dictate her choices. That night, her sapphire-blue dress, her cheerful spirit, and her independent presence became symbols of everything Pierce coveted yet could not claim. Each word she spoke, every step she took backward towards safety, intensified the dangerous calculus in his mind. Karen's courage shone through even as the tension escalated. She maintained composure, keeping the situation controlled, despite the invisible threat pressing closer. In that brief encounter, she exemplified bravery and self-assuredness, a stark contrast to the quiet darkness that lurked in Pierce's obsessive mind. The emotional weight of this confrontation lies in its universality. Everyone watching can recognize moments of facing unexpected threats, moments where courage and decisiveness define survival. Karen, in those final minutes before the unthinkable, represented the best of human resilience, the unwillingness to be controlled or diminished by someone else's desire. Yet, in Pierce's deluded perception, her defiance transformed the situation. What was an ordinary rejection to any rational mind became an intolerable affront to his obsessive thinking. The stage was set for tragedy, where innocence and courage would confront possession and delusion in a fleeting, fateful encounter. Have you ever faced someone who didn't respect your boundaries? Tell us in the comments. Franklin Pierce's obsession, once quiet and hidden, reached its tragic climax. Karen Stone's rejection ignited a delusional belief that her refusal was a personal attack, a challenge to his sense of control. In that moment, his desire to possess turned deadly. He acted not out of hatred, but from a dangerous distortion of affection and entitlement that no one, not even the brightest light like Karen, could satisfy. The encounter ended in violence, swift and brutal. Karen struggled, her instincts and strength evident even in her final moments, leaving traces of resistance that decades later would speak through DNA. The physical confrontation was horrifyingly simple in execution, yet devastating in consequence. A young life, vibrant and full of promise, extinguished by a man who had spent years cultivating a private, obsessive fixation. For the community, the tragedy is compounded by the ordinariness of the perpetrator. Pierce had lived among them, polite and unassuming, a reminder that danger can sometimes wear a familiar face. For 62 years, this hidden threat moved through daily life unnoticed, leaving a void that shaped generations. Karen's life was stolen twice. First in the act of violence, and again as the years of uncertainty and grief stretched over her loved ones. The pain of this truth is not abstract. It resonates because it reminds us that vigilance, awareness, and protection of each other are vital. Detective Kincaid's work, the touch DNA, and the genealogy breakthrough show that even decades later, justice can prevail, but only when we recognize the importance of uncovering hidden truths. We protect each other here. Join our community, share stories, and help us ensure that every voice matters. The courtroom in Royal Oak was filled with a quiet tension that seemed to hold decades of unanswered questions. Franklin Pierce, once Silas Decker, now 86, sat with the frailty of age contrasting the weight of the crime he had committed. Every eye in the room seemed to measure him against the life he had stolen, the years lost, and the grief endured. Among the spectators, Beverly Sterling, now 85, stood as a living testament to the years spent haunted by memory. She approached the stand with a deliberate calm, each step echoing the resilience that had carried her through decades of silent anguish. When she finally faced Pierce, the courtroom seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in a space suspended between the past and the present. Her voice, steady yet laced with emotion, addressed the man who had destroyed her friend's life. Every word carried the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions and grief. The years of uncertainty, the endless nights replaying the memory of that final dance, culminated in this confrontation. Her presence was not just witness, it was accountability incarnate. The visual of the frail man in the defendant's chair, juxtaposed with the determined woman who had waited decades for truth, was striking. Pierce's expression was unreadable, a mixture of resignation and disbelief that the ordinary life he had lived in the community could no longer hide the consequences of his actions. For the community watching, this moment was more than a trial. It was the reckoning of decades-long injustice. The years of silence, fear, and sorrow were now crystallized in the courtroom, tangible and undeniable. The reality was clear. The crime had remained unchanging, while the lives it touched carried forward with scars that time alone could never erase. Beverly Sterling's voice cut through the courtroom like a sharp, unyielding truth. "This isn't closure. This is truth," she said, her words reverberating with the weight of decades. It was a declaration that no amount of time could soften, the acknowledgement that justice, when delayed, changes the nature of grief, but it does not erase it. The spectators, many of whom had grown up hearing whispers of Karen Stone's disappearance, felt the magnitude of that statement. For the first time in 62 years, the story had a resolution. Yet the resolution was not comfort, it was clarity. Beverly's words reminded everyone that truth, even when painful, is a force that shapes memory and honors the lives of those lost. For the community, the trial was more than legal proceedings. It was the collective exhale of a town that had carried a hidden fear for decades. Families who had felt unsafe, who had heard the ghost of Karen's story in hushed tones, finally saw that the crime had been confronted, even if the perpetrator had aged quietly among them. The parents of Karen Stone, Eleanor and Arthur, had long passed, never knowing this moment. Their absence was felt as a silent ache, underscoring the enormity of their loss. Beverly's presence symbolized the continuity of memory and the persistence of those left behind. She stood as a living bridge between the injustice of the past and the reckoning of the present. In that courtroom, truth was a tangible presence. It was not a balm, not a replacement for the years lost, but a declaration that the facts could no longer be ignored, that the story of Karen Stone would finally be told in full. For the first time in decades, the community confronted the final chapter of a narrative that had haunted them silently for generations. The case of Karen Stone is a testament to the evolution of science and its ability to speak when the world was silent. In 1961, forensic tools were limited. Fibers, photographs, and scant traces were all investigators had. Mistakes and oversights compounded the tragedy, leaving the crime unresolved for decades. Fast forward to 2023, when Detective Alana Kincaid and her team approached the dusty evidence box with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Karen's sapphire-blue dress, the canvas tarp, and fibers once dismissed as meaningless, now held the power to reveal a hidden truth. Advanced touch DNA analysis, unimaginable in 1961, allowed investigators to identify the unseen struggle, the presence of a man who had hidden in plain sight for over 60 years. The painstaking work of investigative genetic genealogy opened another door. Each distant relative identified, each branch of the family tree traced, brought the team closer to the man responsible. Science did what memory could not. It bypassed the years of human error, fear, and forgetfulness. What was once lost to history was now quantifiable, provable, undeniable. This segment of the story emphasizes a critical lesson. Justice is not bound by time, but it is amplified by the tools and persistence of those who refuse to forget. Every modern technique applied in this cold case demonstrates the marriage of patience, technology, and determination. While the past cannot be rewritten, the truth can finally be documented, verified, and confronted. For viewers, the narrative underscores the importance of diligence and innovation. Crimes may go unsolved for decades, but science can rewrite the narrative, ensuring that even the most hidden wrongs have the potential to be corrected. Karen Stone's story, long a symbol of injustice, transformed into a testament of human ingenuity and perseverance. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving a sense of gravity that lingered long after the gavel fell. Franklin Pierce, now an elderly man, would finally face the consequences of a crime committed decades ago. Yet, the true weight of the story lay not in his frailty, but in the lesson it imparted. Monsters age, but the crimes they commit remain frozen in time, demanding reckoning. Karen Stone's story serves as a chilling reminder that danger can appear ordinary, even harmless. For 62 years, the town had lived with the knowledge of a crime unresolved, the memory of a bright life snuffed out too early. The contrast between the passage of time and the permanence of wrongdoing illuminates the importance of vigilance, awareness, and justice that endures. Reflecting on the evolution of forensic science reinforces another truth. Progress allows the past to speak. The fibers, the dress, the DNA, all symbols of persistence, revealed a narrative long hidden, proving that even decades of silence cannot erase accountability. Every piece of evidence, once ignored or underestimated, became a key to the ultimate revelation. For the community, and for viewers, the moral is clear. Crimes may age, perpetrators may blend into ordinary life, but justice, though delayed, can still be claimed. It is a testament to resilience, patience, and the courage of those who refuse to forget. Karen's life, though tragically cut short, finally achieved recognition in the story of her own truth. Don't miss the next hidden truth. Stay informed. Subscribe now. The narrative closes on the paradox of justice. Time moves forward. Monsters age. But the pursuit of truth is timeless. Karen Stone's legacy endures not only in memory, but as a reminder that every unanswered question, every hidden story, can one day be illuminated.